Hi, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And some of you are actually overseas, so good morning to you guys. Um, so today we have our masterclass with Nelson, and he's going to go through with us some of the top artwork pieces that are featured in the different museums. And hopefully, if you guys enjoy it quite a bit, and hopefully, we can actually bring it as a series for more art history classes and all that with Nelson. Nelson, all the you can actually.
Thank you so much. And it's an honor to be here with you, with the Singapore Cricket Club. I never expected this to happen, you know. So thanks, Cassie, for organizing this session. I will start by saying that choosing which masterpieces to show you is always an act of arrogance. And I apologize in advance for being perhaps a bit the best art I can speak about is the one that motivates me on the day. Now, the thing with painting, with sculpture, and so on is that on different days we want to see different things. It's almost like music, you know. What's your favorite song today? It's not going to be your favorite song tomorrow. So I've chosen a few of the masterpieces from some European museums only because those are the ones that I know best. I'm very critical of Eurocentrism in the arts. So this is important to say. I believe that every culture produced amazing masterpieces and definitely not just the West. Okay. So I'm very, very critical of that Western tendency. When you learn history of art, 90%, more than 99% of everything you learn was made in the West. And I think it's time to change that. Okay. So I repeat, I am extremely critical of that. But the art pieces that I know best, they're mostly Western. And that's the reason why I've made this choice for this introductory lesson. And we are starting with a few um, let's begin with some images. So what I would like to show you, first of all, are the spectacular masterpieces from ancient Greece, which are now housed at the British Museum. So the Parthenon sculptures. So the first museum we are going to travel to is going to be the British Museum. Now, there's a whole debate. Let's not get at the moment, at least at the moment, into politics, although I do have my opinion where these sculptures should be, and not perhaps in here, not in Britain. But politics aside, I would like to say that this is one of the world's most important artistic creations. What you are seeing now are just leftovers, they're just remnants of what has survived. This sculpture suffered quite a lot over the centuries. You would have a horse rider, you would have the horses with the heads. All of these sculptures would have had heads and hands and things like that. There's a whole missing section in here. Again, the heads are gone, the hands and the arms are gone. There's another section missing in there. And then you have another horse missing at the very end. So essentially, this is a very incomplete what has survived from over the centuries. And what you see depicted in here is essentially a triangle. So if you look at the shapes, they fit within the triangular shape of the Greek temples. If you look at the front of Greek temples, usually at the top, on top of the columns, you would have these triangular shapes. So there are sections missing, huge sections, as you can see. All the heads are off, apart from one head, and all the hands are gone, and some arms as well. Now, if you study Greek mythology, you know that essentially, this is a modern interpretation of Greek myth, but in the 21st century, we tend to assume that Greek myths were depictions of human nature. Uh, I'd say that's very tendentious. That's very psychoanalytical. That's quite Freudian in approach. So it's quite 20th century, 21st century. Perhaps that's not how the ancient Greeks would see their own religion. Of course, they would have believed in those myths. They would have believed in the stories as being factual. Nevertheless, there is a lot we can learn about human nature when we study this type of images. What we see on the left is the rising sun, literally. This is the chariot of the god Helios, which is the sun. And as Helios starts to travel across the sky, the horses that pull the chariot, they're still full of energy. They have a lot of rhythmic vitality that you see in the morning. Nature just woke up. And then you have a series of gods that I shall not discuss at the moment. And towards the very end, you have the exhausted, the exhausted horses of the chariot of the sun. So this composition is also cosmic. It represents the cycle between day and night. It represents also the movement of the stars. I mean, the sun being the star that we see from the earth, a big one during the day. There's a lot of symbology. It's not just about people, and it's not just about the gods. The gods also depict larger, bigger, grander schemes in the universe. Allow me to show you a slightly more detailed image. I would like you to pay special attention to the beauty of the human body. Of course, that the ancient Greeks, and when I say the ancient Greeks, I mean pretty much everything between the 6th century before Christ and even the 1st century after Christ. You don't really have ancient Greeks in that period, but you have the Hellenistic Empire, and then you have Greek colonies that survived the Roman conquest. But essentially, when you study the ancient Greeks, there is this great love for the physical beauty. These are bodies of athletes. You don't see in ancient Greek sculptures deformed bodies, for example. You don't see sick people. You don't see the elderly. You don't even see babies in ancient Greece, generally speaking. You don't see portraits of babies or dwarfs or mutilated people, or very rarely, even when wounded people are depicted, and that's going to appear later on during the Hellenistic period. And by the way, the Hellenistic period was during Alexander the Great, when the Greeks conquered the world. They conquered the known world. They go even as far as India. Can you imagine? Over 2,000 years ago, on foot, literally, conquering the whole of the Persian Empire. Alexander conquers the whole of the Persian Empire and even reaches India. It's quite amazing. But back to the ancient Greeks. Even when soldiers are represented wounded and dying, they're still incredibly noble. They die like heroes. They die like gods, if gods can die. You don't see the frail horror on people's faces, for example. You don't see sickness in ancient Greek sculpture. Who said Photoshop didn't exist in the ancient world? Yes, it did. Everybody looks magnificent in this type of images. The sculptor that was in charge of the Parthenon images was Phidias. Phidias is spelled with PH, okay? So it's Phidias. And he is considered arguably the greatest genius of the classical period, of the golden period of Greek sculpture. Phidias created this style that you are looking at the moment. And the style is easily recognized because even the women, as you can see, there is male nudity, but the women are dressed, the women are covered. But even when the female body is represented on the nude and dressed up on top, essentially you see the body through the clothes. And that's why I said represented on the nude, although they are clothed. It's almost like if the fabrics were wet. And because they were wet, they stick to the body and they reveal all the shapes that the nude body would have underneath the clothes, if that makes any sense. So let's move into another image. This is a night scene of the British Museum. So this photograph was taken during the evening. And look at the incredible swirling of the fabric. I mean, it's really truly amazing. It's quite spectacular. So these draped, dressed figures at the same time they are nude. So the ancient Greeks were great lovers of physical fitness. Let's not forget that when I mean ancient Greeks, I'm not just talking about Athenians. And of course, Athenians were extremely fit, like every of the ancient Greek states. But the Spartans were worldwide renowned for their physical abilities. And eventually Sparta conquers Athens because of that. You know, they had a superior army. And exercise was very important to the ancient Greeks. Do not forget that the Olympic Games, for example, the Olympics, they were a religious ritual. Yes, you heard me right. They were religious, they were sacred. Actually, during the Olympics, all the wars would have ceased. They would have stopped. All the wars would have been interrupted because the rituals were so sacred to all of the Greeks that even if two or different city states were fighting, they would have interrupted it during the Olympics. During the Olympics, the sole purpose was to devote the best that humanity could offer to the gods. So there is this feeling of reverence towards physical fitness. That's the idea I want to leave with you. Now, please pay attention to the exhaustion in the horse's face, the dilated nostrils, breathing in and out oxygen. There is this feeling of exhaustion because we are witnessing the end of the day. So the horses of the gods, of the sun god Helios, they're now exhausted. The Greeks, I'm generalizing throughout this lesson because this is an introductory lesson. And on introductory lessons, you can't really go into very small, specific details. I prefer to give you a general, like a bird's eye view over the Greek culture. So generalizing, the ancient Greeks would rather understate than overstate things. So they would rather choose harmony than expressionism, if you prefer. So if they had to choose between exaggeration and caricature or containment and elegance, they would have chosen the containment and the elegance. I'm talking about the fine arts in here. I'm not talking about popular arts because there's a lot of ancient Greek handicrafts. You know, you've got all sorts of things for the house which were extremely expressionistic and even humorous and so on. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about state commissions and temple commissions. I'm talking about public art. So the grand ancient Greek art was more on the side of containment, subtlety, elegance, and harmony. But even so, you can really feel the exhaustion on these horses' heads, the bulging eyes, the dilated nostrils, and the gasping mouth. Before we talk about this, and you have to be prepared for a shock, and let me tell you a story. The ancient Greeks were spectacular storytellers. They have the most beautiful mythology. It's almost incomparable. It's like when you start reading Greek myths, not many world mythologies will survive the comparison. They were they were just the best storytellers. And there is a story I would like to tell you. And on this respect, allow me a moment of vanity. But I do disagree. I do disagree with the official explanation that the British Museum proposes. So if we go back into the original image, the one that contains the full triangle with all the missing bits. Let's not forget that the most important bit that is missing is the sculpture of the goddess Athena. And Athena was the goddess that gave name to the capital of Greece, to Athens. Athena, she was the goddess of wisdom. And the Greeks were lovers of wisdom. They believed in a healthy body should contain, should encapsulate a healthy soul, a healthy spirit, a healthy mind. So they believed in health. And when I say health, I'm using the term very broadly. All kinds of health, mental health, intellectual health, psychological health, moral and ethical health. They were extremely ethical on the way they conducted themselves as citizens that belong to a polis, to a city, to a polis state, you know, good citizens, healthy, fit, intelligent, very studious, at least the rich. The poor had no access to education, of course, but within the ancient worlds, they were the most literate civilization. And what you see in here is this huge gap that represents Athens. And according to the story, there were two Greek gods that were fighting for the title of, it's almost like a beauty contest, but they were not really, they were not really awarding beauty, they were awarding relevance. So two gods were fighting for the title. You had Neptune, or Jupiter, as it's also called for the Romans. So essentially you had the god of the sea, and then you had the goddess of wisdom, which is Athena. So Jupiter, or Neptune as you prefer, created this incredible miracle. He hits his trident against the ground. He hits the trident against the ground. And what you end up seeing is this incredible stream of water that just explodes on the top of the Parthenon Hill in Athens. So what a miracle. Salty water, seawater, erupting like from a volcano, erupting at the very, very, very top of one of the tallest hills in Athens. A wondrous miracle. And then Athena arrives. And she arrives with something very humble. She brings an olive tree. So she teaches the Greeks how to cultivate the olive tree and how to become prosperous. The Greeks award Athena the rank of the most important goddess for the city of Athens. Now, it might seem like a very irrelevant story, but it's extremely, extremely telling. I would like you to think about it for a second. I would like you to think how many of the ancient civilizations would have chosen understatement over incredible miracles. Not many. So this is very telling of the ancient Greek mentality. They preferred Athena, a goddess that can reason, a goddess that can give them something that is logical and something that is useful to this life, something like the olive tree. They preferred Athena over Neptune, that created the most spectacular firework or circus show. This is extremely telling of the ancient Greeks. Now, nevertheless, they also had other stories which reveal a side to the gods which I would like to share with you. And this is where I collide with the British Museum explanation. Now let's look into the images again. And what we have in here is there are two goddesses sitting there. And then you also have two goddesses here on the right. I mean, there's another goddess there. Let's forget that for a moment. You have these two goddesses right here. Now, the British Museum assumes that Demeter and Persephone, they are sitting in here where my cursor is moving. So they are these two women on the chair. I don't buy that. The ancient Greeks were extremely expressive peoples, and they knew how to create images that speak to the mind as well as to the senses. I believe, but this is just a belief, there is no evidence whatsoever that Demeter and Persephone are either here or there. We just don't know, okay? But I'd rather tell you a story that I think will touch you much more. And I'm going to bring you down into the nocturnal photo of the British Museum. And just for a moment, let's assume that you have Demeter and Persephone. We don't know which is which, but I'd assume that the mother, Demeter, she's the one sitting on the chair, and Persephone, she's the one reclining on mom's lap. Now, according to the legend, and I would like to tell you this story because it's quite a story. So bear with me, look into the screen and just allow your minds to travel for a second. It's quite a story. Demeter, she's the goddess of agriculture. It's almost like she's the one that, so the mother, she's the one that brings life into the soil. It's almost like Mother Earth, if you prefer. Persephone was her daughter. And according to the Greek myth, and there are several variations on this myth, the Greeks were not very specific with their religion. You know, you end up having 3, 4, 5, 6 different stories. But according to the mainstream story, Persephone, the daughter, she was playing in the fields, and then there's an earthquake. There is this gigantic earthquake. The earth shakes, it shatters, it opens up, and the chasm swallows up Persephone. She falls into the void. She falls into the abyss. And then the earth quietly closes back. So she's now trapped in the center of the world. And what do you have in the center of the planets, in the center of the earth? You have Hades. You have hell. According to the Greeks, the souls of the living would inhabit the surface of the earth, but then the souls of the dead would go down into the underworld. And the underworld was not really an amazing place. No, it was not paradise. That was guaranteed. It was more of this, I could say horrible. It was more of a horrible place where the souls would endure forever, blind, cold, and lost. So this is the Greek vision of the afterlife. Now, Persephone, she's now trapped in the underworld. She's now trapped in the Hades. She's now trapped in hell. And the king of hell, the king of the underworld, kidnapped her. Okay? So you have a kidnap taking place. Now, when the mother, when Demeter, she finds out that her daughter went disappearing, for several days, she travels through the whole of the universe in search for her daughter. She goes all the way to the top of the Olympus, which was the highest mountain, according to the ancient Greek mythology, where all the gods, not all, but most of the gods were living. She goes all the way up to the top of the Olympus, all the way down into hell, into the underworld. And when Demeter enters the underworld and she finds Persephone's trapped, she puts a curse, she puts a spell on the whole of the universe. So she threatens the cosmos. Demeter, the mother, she says, if my daughter doesn't come back to me, so if she's not released and does not come back to me, everything in the planet will die. So it's a death threat, you know? At the same time, the gods of hell says, oh, no, 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 no. If Persephone if she's taken away from me, then I'm going to release all the souls of the dead. They will come up above. They will mingle with the living, and there shall be no space on earth for so many people, because all the dead will resurrect and they'll come back into the living. And it's going to be like a zombie show, you know, it's going to be like a horror show, the living and the dead living together. Now, so you have a fight between two gods. There is a meeting, and finally all the gods decide that the daughter, Persephone, she's going to spend 6 months of the year with her mother, and then she's going to spend the remaining 6 months with her new husband, so to speak. So essentially, and according to the ancient Greeks, this is why you have the 4 seasons. Think with me. Every time Demeter knows that her daughter is about to leave and go back to hell, Demeter becomes very sad, and autumn arrives, and finally winter. Nothing is born. And then when she knows that Persephone is about to return to her, you have the joy of spring and finally the fruits of the summer. So it's quite an amazing story that explains why we have the 4 seasons. And there's something beautiful about mythology, because as someone said, and I cannot recall which thinker said this, I believe a philosopher, somebody very wise, said that mythology is a group of lies that end up being truthful. I quite like this definition. So the power of myth is that these are fictional stories that are also very, very intelligent, very truthful, and they cosmos for us. Now, before we finish with the ancient Greek sculptures and the British Museum, I'm about to show you another sculpture from the British Museum. Get ready for the shock. All the ancient sculptures, the Greek sculptures, were painted. All the ancient sculptures were painted, full stop, and the Greek ones were no exception. And this garish thing that you are looking at the moment is a reconstruction. It's quite kitsch, isn't it? It's quite ugly. It's a reconstruction of colors that this sculpture used to have. How do we know? We know it through chemical analysis. If you go on the surface of the marble, and marble is quite porous, so it's quite absorbent, the marble has absorbed some pigment. It's not visible to the naked eye. You can't see it just by looking at the sculpture, but it's very detectable if you do chemical analysis. So scientists have analyzed the surface of the Greek marbles and they've discovered these incredible patterns. So soldiers would be wearing these spectacular uniforms. I mean, it's quite something, isn't it? And all of these patterns would have been painted in the original white sculpture that you see in here. So no, the ancient Greek sculptures were indeed not white. They were not white, I repeat. Now, I would like to share with you a little a little thought. Are you recovered from the shock that Greek sculptures were so garish? I've spoken with a friend of mine. She's one of the main tour guides of the Parthenon Museum in Athens, an archaeologist herself, and a very wise woman. She must be 80 something now. And she told me that when she said that it's no novelty that Greek sculptures were painted. I mean, we've known this for over a century now. That's well known within the scientific community. The difference is that now we have the tools to actually see which exact colors were there, and also all the patterns that are invisible to the human eye, because we have the equipment. But essentially, she says that those garish colors, they make sense. I was kind of being naughty, so I was questioning her. I was like teasing her, and I said, "Oh, come on, Maria Lisa, those sculptures were horrid, weren't they? Like really bright and really vivid." And she said, "No, Nelson, it makes all sense because the same way that a good architect would have painted the house on a brighter color than it should be, because over the years the colors fade." And ancient colors used to fade considerably. Do not forget that. We have modern, better pigments nowadays. So a lot of the ancient colors would have disappeared. They were not light fast. They would have faded really quickly under the direct, bright sunlight of Greece. So according to Marilisa, and I think she has a point, two things happen. First of all, you have the bright colors under the sun. So that means the sunlight, the intensity of the sun actually visually bleaches the colors because the light and the shadow become more important than the actual color. You know, if you have a very bright object under the sun, surprisingly, the color doesn't look bright. If the sunlight is really intense, as it happens in Greece, the whiteness of the light washes over the objects. Okay, if that makes any sense. It's almost like if the human eye could not see so much light. We get overwhelmed by the quantity of light, so it gets washed away. Secondly, the colors themselves would have faded over the years, which means they would have turned into really elegant and muted, more sophisticated colors. I think she has a point. I'll leave it up to you to decide if the ancient Greek sculptures were garish or not. If you have any questions, please go ahead to turn on your microphones and ask. And meanwhile, And by the way, feel free to ask questions at any time during the session, okay? Meanwhile, we are looking into another spectacular sculpture, the Discobolus. And again, it's the praising of the human body. It has to do with physical beauty. It has to do with harmony. The incredible geometry that lies within the human figure. The Greeks were great lovers of mathematics. The Greeks were intellectuals. So they wanted to find eternal laws that would govern reality. Mathematics is arguably the best way of doing that. So when you turn into mathematics, you can really go from the particular into the universal. You can find laws that are greater than just accidents or exceptions. The Greeks were not interested in the accidental or in the incidental. They were much more interested in what is grander than human reality. They were much more into eternal schemes, almost like real science. It's a kind of a proto science of yeah. Before science was born, the Greeks already developed rationality, logic, reasoning. Very important tools for scientific developments. So essentially, the Greek sculptures were no exceptions. They were trying to find the canons, so the proportions that would guide reality and the ideal body. According to some sculptors, it would be the ideal body would have 7 heads of height. Other sculptors would say 8 heads of height. So there is a debate, of course. Nothing is static, not even in the ancient world. You always have debates. But just to complete this section of the lesson, what you see depicted in here, they're not real people. They are ideals. They're ideals of people that do not exist. Greek arts, apart from the Hellenistic period, which we are going to see after, apart from the Hellenistic period, so during Alexander the Great, Greek art is never realistic. I repeat, it's never realistic. It's based on reality, but reality is always idealized. Okay? Now we are traveling to the Louvre. And you have a sculpture at the end of these staircases, and this sculpture is Hellenistic. So it comes later. The golden age of the Greek art is like is roughly the 5th century before Christ. The Hellenistic period comes later, and it kind of stretches, you know. So, but just as a guideline, everything that is around, let's say, the 2nd century before Christ, the 1st century before Christ, you could kind of call it Hellenistic already. It stretches, of course. And the sculpture we are looking into here is the victory of Samothrace, which is an island in Greece. The sculpture was named after the island where it was found. And you see, again, the love for nudity, even when the body is draped. You have this incredible, really beautiful, I think, sense of movement in the fabrics. You can really feel the wind hitting against the victory of Samothrace. The victory, the ancient Greeks would call her a Nike. Nike is spelled Nike. And The Nike of Samothrace, as the name says, it represents victory. And in the past, some of these sculptures used to adorn the front of ships. So you'd have Greek ships with Nikes at the very front, it's almost like if the goddess would bless and protect the ship, like an amulet. Now, what you have in this type of imagery is already a love for reality. There is still great, of course. I mean, the image is dynamic, the image is grand, it's heroic, it's divine. But at the same time, look at the beautifully observed structure of the wings of birds. So you start to have realism that is combined, that conflates with idealism. It's kind of confused. You have a mix between ideal and at the same time real, hyper real, I even dare to say. So the Nike of Samothrace is a wonderful example of Hellenistic sculpture. And generally speaking, a Hellenistic sculpture tends to be more, there is more movement than the golden age of Greek sculpture, which was much more serene in comparison with the Hellenistic one. So Hellenist artists are more interested in depicting torsion of bodies, the flow of the winds, or even tempests, fights between humans or gods, and so on. So more dynamic compositions, as in opposition to the more ancient Greeks, you know, the classical period, which prefers a repose and stillness, calmness. If I had to elect one image that moved me beyond any other from the images that I had seen live, this one would have been a very strong contender to the title. We are now traveling, so we're slowly going east, it seems. We started in Britain at the British Museum, then we went to the Louvre, and now we are in Athens. Athens, the heart of everything you have seen so far in this lecture, where everything came from. We are now at the Archaeological Museum of Athens, and this sculpture is absolutely mind-blowing for its meaning. Now, you can appreciate images in many different ways. One of the ways is aesthetic. So you look at the beauty of an image. Another is almost like a biography of the artist. So it's more expressionistic, you know, like you look at the Van Gogh and it touches you. A lot of the powerful qualities of Van Gogh's paintings, they exist because we know his biography, we know his life story. So when you look at the images, you think of the artist, if that makes any sense. And then you can also appreciate images because of their deeper meaning. This is an image that moved me, actually, when I understood what it depicts. What you see in here, boy, a very young boy, he's probably not more than 7 or 8 years old, max. A very small boy riding a huge horse in comparison. Apparently, the symbology of this image is that there used to be races of slaves, and you would have 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 slaves competing in this race. And whoever won would have been liberated, would have become a free person, perhaps even a citizen of Athens, perhaps, but essentially a free person. So what you see in here, and let's look into some of the details, is the despair of this young boy trying to ride the horse and probably looking left into some of his opponents that is either approaching or even surpassing him. And the despair of this young boy is so beautifully depicted in the facial expression, in the body expression. I mean, just look at the zigzags, the dynamics of this body shape, even the muscle, because he was used to hard working, he was used to slavery, he had to work, you know, and it's quite a testimonial. It's quite a testimonial to the psychology of the model. So this sculpture, I consider pieces in the history of sculpture in terms of depicting what was going through the reality of this young boy, of this young person. What a wondrous work of art. And I really advise you to go to Athens and visit. All right, Greek world. And now we went quickly to Egypt. This is not the image I want to show you, but I'm using this image as just for comparison. So when you go to ancient Egypt, you see these. I mean, they're quite beautiful, of course. You see these mummies, usually gilded, so lots of gold representing the face, the feet. As you can see, the feet have been gilded as well. They're gold, and gold. Let's not forget of the soul. So these are mummies. These are dead bodies that have been wrapped up and then gilded, because the soul is immortal, and that's what the ancient Egyptians believed. That's why they would embalm. Now, if you look at the faces, pretty much most of the ancient Egyptians' faces, they're not real portraits. They're not portraits in the sense that they do not depict recognizable people. So they're kind of generic masks. All the masks look the same, even when they represent different brows are very long. You have always these noses are generic, the eyes are symbolic, the ears are usually totally generic and oversized, and so on and so forth. So these portraits, these are symbols of people, but they are not portraits in the sense that they're not recognized. Why am I showing you this image? I would like you to compare this with what the Greeks, and now you know better, perhaps we should know, because it was during the Hellenistic Empire, when Alexander the Great conquers Egypt. So when the Greeks do conquer it, they do conquer Egypt. Egypt becomes a Greek colony. They create a new capital, which is called Alexandria. Alexander was not vain at all, was he? To name the capital, the new capital of Greece, of Egypt after himself, it's quite something. So Alexandria becomes the most important city in Egypt. It's full of Greeks. But near Cairo, Recently, when I say recently, it's the 19th century. Um, a cemetery was found in a place called Fayum that contains coffins. This, and look at the incredible thing that you're about to witness. Now we're going back to the British Museum. Look at this. Wow. So what you are seeing now is an ancient Egyptian sarcophagus. So you have the Egyptian gods, was mummified. So literally you have a mummy inside this feet, like you've seen before in the previous example. But now look at this. As we go up, wow, Greek letters. And what's written in here, so I repeat, this is at the British Museum. It's written in bad Greek, by the way, because it's misspelled, but it's written farewell Artemidoros. So Artemidoros was this young man that died. He must have been about 21 years old. You still have the golds, the laurels that represent the immortality of the soul and also the heroic to the winners of the Olympic Games. You know, the athletes would have been crowned with laurels. But what you see in here is a face that is recognizable. It's unlike anything the Egyptians had done, pretty much. So what you see in here is a portrait, a real portrait, and it's a portrait of a Greek person because the name is there, Artemidoros, and it's written in Greek, farewell. So these were Greek people that were living in Egypt, but during the Roman conquest, I know it's a bit confusing. I'll repeat this again. We are now looking at examples of the first century after Christ. Okay, so 1,900 years ago. We are looking at the art made by the Greeks that lived in Egypt, but during the Roman conquest, because then the Romans took over from the Greeks and Egypt became Roman. You have these incredible portraits. They're called the Fayum portraits because they were found in that Fayum cemetery. If you want to research on them, and I strongly advise you to, Fayum, it's spelled F-A-Y-U-M. And the best collection of Fayum portraits that I have seen is at the Egyptian Museum in Berlin. Okay? So this example I'm showing you now is in London at the British Museum, but the finest collection I have seen, it's in Berlin. It's at the Egyptian Museum. And I'm going to show you a few more of these masks. The sarcophagus are really beautiful because not only they are a portrait of a face 2,000 years ago, they are a window to the past, if you prefer. It's also a window to what's inside the sarcophagus, to the person that is inside. So it's a double window, if you prefer. It's a time window and it's also a spatial window that depicts the person. Do not forget that the eyes would have been painted from memory or from imagination, because these portraits were done after the person died. So they were done at the moment of their death, literally. So the eyes would have been opened by the artist. Another example of a Fayum portrait of a child. It's again covering the sarcophagus of this small mummy. And look at the incredible haircut. So the Fayum portraits, they're so real that they tell us a lot about the fashion of those days and how people used to dress and wear. Literally, he's got a ponytail and then two little tufts of hair. and the rest of the head is shaven. It's quite incredible. Again, the eyes are just symbolic. If you want, you could claim that they represent the fact that the dead person still sees. They can still see you because of the soul, because of the spirit. Look at this one. It's incredibly contemporary. I mean, these paintings, they were 2,000 years old. 2,000 years old, can you believe it? And they are like real people. All of these people would have been recognizable if they passed through us on the streets. Now, which technique was used to paint the Fayum portraits? If anyone has any guesses, please write them down on the chat box below, or you can turn on the microphone and say something. Which technique was this? What was the medium? What was the type of paint that was used to paint the Fayum portraits? Look at the powerful, powerful portrait that you have in here. So these ancient Greek, Hellenistic, Roman, Egyptian paintings, they look so modern. This could be a portrait, let's say, from the 17th century, easily. This could be a Baroque portrait, a European Baroque portrait from the 17th century. Easy. And yet, it's 2,000 years old. Now, the question to the I have an answer from Eloise. Egg tempera. So it's not tempura, it's tempera. An egg tempera, just a quick one, is a type of paint. So essentially, when you paint with egg tempera, what you do is that you crack an egg, you take the yolk, so the yellow bit, you mix that yellow bit with water, and then into that liquidy yellow glue, you add the powdered pigments. So imagine blue powder, and that will make blue paint. So egg tempera is a very durable type of paint. Now, some of the Fayum portraits were painted in egg tempera, yes, but the vast majority were not painted in egg tempera. So you have to try again. I'm going to give you a tip. Your Crayola wax crayons, do you guys remember when you were children and you had those wax crayons? Back in the day when I was young, it used to be Crayola, the brand everybody had. So get ready for the shock. The Fayum portraits, the vast majority of them, they were painted with encaustics. Now, for those who don't know what encaustics is, the technique is just as difficult as the name. If you think encaustics is a difficult word, now get ready for the amazement. It's even harder to paint with encaustics. Essentially, encaustics are wax crayons, let's imagine, so colored wax that you melt in a pot. So you have several pots, metal containers. Your palette is many pots that have been fired, so they're hot. And you have molten colored waxes. Imagine blue wax, yellow wax, white wax, brown, black, you name it. And what you do is you dip your brush on wax and very quickly, listen to this, you have only a few seconds, very quickly you apply the brush strokes to represent the face. Now, I'm going to challenge any painter in Singapore or in London or in any of the cities that are now attending this live lesson. I would like to challenge any of the current living masters To do a portrait in the style of Fayum with molten wax, it's incredibly difficult. The wax hardens in just a few seconds. And according to chemical analysis, this is pretty much pure wax. So, yes, it has some additives. It's not just wax, but it would still harden really, really quickly. Now, rest assured, I'm sure the Greeks had a secret. Historians don't know exactly what secret that is. We know that the Greeks had hot tools, like metal tools, that they would then use to imprint the wax already on the wood, on the panel, and move it around. But nevertheless, it would have been way too hard to paint these portraits. What historians believe is that the wood itself would have also have been warmed. So probably the wood itself would have been hot. And by being hot, the wax would have taken a little bit longer to cool down and harden. But what an amazing portrait. So now you know that all of these Fayum portraits were done with molten wax, including the super detailed, super realistic one at the British Museum. Okay? Now, we have to move on because the lesson is kind of, if everyone has extra 10 minutes, I would like you to please stay with me. I will speed up now. This incredible sculpture is at the Vatican Museums, and that's the next museum we are visiting. We are now in the Vatican in Rome, and we are looking at the Laocoon. The Laocoon is the most amazing Hellenistic sculpture. When it was dug out from the earth, Michelangelo was present. Let's not forget that the ancient Greek sculptures and ancient Roman sculptures, they were lost for many centuries. They just disappeared. So during the Middle Ages, we didn't really know how ancient Greek art looked like. Most of it was just buried or hidden or shattered to pieces, broken, etc. And then what happens? During there was a crisis in Europe. Essentially, the popes moved to Avignon in France. They stayed there for quite a while. And afterwards, they decided to move back to Rome. So when the Pope moved back to Rome, the city of Rome was already kind of abandoned and derelict. The Pope decided to create new, grander, more beautiful buildings and turned Rome into the most beautiful city in the world. So as the foundations for the new buildings were dug, what happened was that they started digging out the most incredible sculptures that had been hiding under the earth for over 1,000 years, if that makes any sense. So Michelangelo was present when this sculpture was unveiled 1,400 years after it had been sculpted. And I'm showing you this sculpture because it represents the priest Laocoon. He was a priest of the god Apollo. But there was a problem with Laocoon. During the Trojan War, Laocoon threw an arrow against the Trojan horse. And that was something that Apollo didn't enjoy because the god Apollo was supporting the invaders. The god Apollo was supporting the Trojan horse plot or ploy or plan, if you prefer. So Apollo, enraged, decides to punish Laocoon. So he sends serpents into the temple, and the serpents attack Laocoon and his children. So what you see in here is this incredible, incredible depiction of human suffering and also a beautiful, beautiful rendering of human anatomy. I repeat, this love for the human body, this love for physical fitness is very, very notorious in this image as well. So you've got Laocoon over there being attacked and bitten by the serpent. And then you have his children also being bitten by different serpent heads. It's quite an amazing image of human suffering and also human condition, and also that we cannot do anything against the gods. That was another of the messages the Greeks wanted to convey. Here's some details. It's quite touching. The, the pathos, the suffering that you see in these images. Look at that. This must be one of the finest portraits in the whole history of the ancient world. It's one of the most expressive depictions of suffering. Just look at that forehead. You don't even need to look at eyes, ears, and mouth and nose. Even just the forehead speaks by itself. It's so wonderfully sculpted. The wrinkles, how the movement of the wrinkles matches the movement of the hair. Everything is corrugated. Everything is full of mountains and valleys. It's all up and down. What an amazing portrait. Another detail, gasping up for hair, pretty much. Please remember that these tips of noses are usually reconstitutions. Noses tend to be broken in ancient sculptures, so usually they put something on top to try to fix it. And I'm going to complete now with the last image of today's lesson. Now we are quickly flying into Madrid, and we are going to the Prado. This is a phenomenal, huge painting by Roger van der Weyden. His name is spelled like this, Weyden. So W-E-Y-D-E-N. Okay? You can find more about him later. This is the deposition of Christ. And as Christ is being brought down from the cross, his mother, the Virgin Mary, she faints. I usually show this specific image, in every art class that I give, practically in every lesson. Not every lesson, every course, usually lesson 1, I tend to teach theory, and I love to show this example. So Eloise, you have seen it before. I love to show this example because I would like everybody in this lesson now to pay attention to the message that is being conveyed by shapes themselves. Now, let's begin by analyzing shapes. What you have here is dead Jesus being brought down from the cross. The Virgin Mary, the mother, she faints. She faints. I mean, look at her face. She's white. She lost all sorts of pinkness, of pink cheeks that you see on the other figures. Okay? So women here and men, they are depicted with quite rosy cheeks, but when you go down to the Virgin Mary, she turned gray, literally. She turned gray. And now look at the body position. She's shaped. She's in the same position as her son Jesus. It's almost like if she also had died herself. She has the shape of the dead body of Jesus. At the same time as she's falling down into the ground, the arms, the body, they're curved very similarly to the arms and body of Jesus. So it's like a echo, 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 echo. They echo each other in terms of shape. As she faints down, look what is happening. She's approaching death. So death is down here waiting for them as their bodies are dropping towards the ground. There's a lot of symbology already hidden in just these shapes. And we haven't even started. This is just the beginning. Now, the skull is also in here to represent the name of the hill, which was called Golgotha, where Jesus was believed to have been crucified. That hill, apparently, and according to ancient writers, was shaped like a skull itself. So the hill had the shape of a skull. Now, this painting was commissioned by a league, by a union, if you prefer, by a body of people, which was the Archers League. In the Baltic Sea, around the Baltic regions, you have some of the oldest unions in history, some of the oldest leagues. And archers, they also had a league. Yes, you heard me right, archers. So this painting was commissioned to the Archers League. And now look at the symbology of shapes. Look at the shape, especially of the body of Jesus. Doesn't it look a bit like a bow and an arrow? It looks like an arch itself. So there is also a symbology in the shape. I would like you to appreciate the spectacular details of Gothic painting. So when you look at paintings from the 15th century, such as this one, Flemish paintings, primitive Flemish paintings, as they are called, primitive not because they were primitive, but because they were the first ones. You have this spectacular use of detail, especially in the fabrics. I mean, the fabrics are just beautiful, beautiful, so three-dimensional, so rich, full of patterns, full of variety. Like all of these fabrics are different to each other. You know, the muted colors, bright colors, detailed, simple. You have all sorts of fabrics, stiff fabrics, soft fabrics, all sorts of fabrics. You also have golden backgrounds. And the gold backgrounds is meant to create this kind of otherworldly, staged, theatrical box where the action, where the scene is taking place. As you can see, there is no landscape behind. It's not realistic again, it's idealistic. You don't have golden backgrounds in reality. This is to create a set, a theatrical set, and they look like actors. Notice how the positions of the bodies, how theatrical this woman on the right, for example. This is not a natural pose to have. Notoriously, the artist was aiming for realism when it came down to her body shape. Don't you agree? It seems like the artist warped reality in order to fit some kinds of geometric symbology. Could that be true? There seems to be more echoes taking place in this image. For example, this man in here is shaped like the letter C, like opening brackets. But that woman there, she's also shaped like an inverted letter C, like closing brackets. It's almost like Jesus was surrounded by two brackets, almost like frames. The main scene is being framed by these two brackets. Let me quickly move on to a very interesting possibility of explanation. This diagram shows the hidden geometry behind the previous image. Can you see it or not? Let's look again. Let's look again. Can you now see the first circle here? So if you followed the heads, the shape of the knee that heads down into the hands, the shape of the Virgin, the body, the fabrics coming back into Jesus, it kind of creates a circle. Now, on the right, you have the same. You have the shape of this woman, heads, the arms of Jesus. They come down, and even the fabrics themselves, they seem to roll towards a kind of a circular shape. And then, mind you, the top circle, which is not visible, it's not as visible, but it's still geometrically correct because the height of the painting, together with the width, it creates this circular diagram, three circles, the, the triangular shape of the Holy Trinity, the three circles that represent God the Father, God the Son, and God the Holy Ghost to Christianity, within the Christian religion. And then within the circles, you have more shapes, you have diagonals that are very relevant in this painting. Now, I would like to conclude today's lesson by saying that this comes from a book called The Painter's Secret Geometry by Charles Boulot. You have the name written in there. So Boulot is spelled Bouleau. I do not agree with everything that Boulot writes. I think sometimes he exaggerates, but nevertheless, this is a good book to get you started within the hidden meanings of medieval geometry in the arts. And now I'm going to complete the lesson with small details, small touching details from the painting we have just seen. These are close-ups of the deposition of Rogier van der Weyden. Again, one of the greatest statements ever done in the history of art to human feeling, to compassion, to empathy. Look at that wound on the side of Jesus. It's like an eye or like a mouth. It's like red lips that are bleeding down. Look at that nail cutting through the flesh. Again, the wounds. It's remarkable. This one is just spectacular. The way the blood drops flow. What an amazing masterpiece that was painted 600 years ago.